Welcome everybody back to U.S.-Russian relations. Last lecture, I looked at how under Roosevelt and under Stalin's Russia, U.S.-Russian relations were reestablished in 1933, with formal diplomatic relations being established in near the end of 1933, shortly after Hitler took power in Germany, which is, of course, going to have a tremendous influence on what is going to happen next. I discussed in that lecture many of the reasons why Russia has now become such a suitable subject of diplomatic relations, having the U.S. having broken off relations since 1917. There was one issue that I didn't actually touch on, and I'll touch on it now here, is that often we're kind of looking at Russia as a Western power, but we often very much forget its role in the East, in particular around China and around Japan, as Japan has become this great power now. And of course, in the First World War, Japan was one of the allies against Germany and Austro-Hungary and Turkey. It was on our side, for those of us who, our origins come from however, very quickly, once the Versailles Conference takes place, the Japanese feel that they got the short end of the stick when all the rewards of victory were being handed out. Certainly one of the things the Japanese had expected Versailles to give them were certainly Germany's concessions inside of China, as you might remember. Every major global power had managed to extract through gunboat diplomacy all sorts of economic concessions in China that included Germany, and the Japanese assumption was that they would take up the German concessions. That did not happen. And so gradually, the Japanese begin to realize that they're not being treated as equal allies. And very quickly, hostility begins to develop, and the Japanese now are seeking out a way to conquer concessions for themselves in China. And that, of course, is going to lead the way to what eventually is going to become Pearl Harbor as far as the Americans are concerned, because as the Japanese are beginning to expand their interests in China, they're come into conflict with the United States. The United States gradually now is regarded as this hostile power in Japan, and so are the Russians. And so there is, certainly in terms of China, there is this interest between the Americans and the Russians to now ham in the Japanese, kind of the way the Americans played the conflict between Russia and Japan during the 1905 war. And now the winds are shifting the other way. And so that is, of course, another reason. This is, again, all about essentially American interests in China, and now their rivalry more so with Japan than with Russia at this point. And so we do begin to see between 1931 and 1939 this expansion, beginning as early as 1933, this expansion in China. At this point, China is now in a civil war between Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek's republic. Interestingly enough, the Russians are hesitating to support Mao Zedong and are supporting Chiang Kai-shek instead. In one sense, Stalin doesn't like other communist parties that he doesn't feel he has completely under his control. And Mao Zedong has not exactly indicated that he will take orders from Moscow the way other communist parties are around the world at this point. Remember, this is the Comintern era, the Communist International era. Um, and so Stalin feels that it would be better to back Chiang Kai-shek if he wants to continue Chiang Kai-shek's republic, if he wants to continue to expand Russian interests. In the late 30s and early 40s, in fact, Japan and Russia will end up in some of the border regions bordering on Russia, and in certain areas in Manchuria, where the Russians feel is their territory, they'll actually go to war there. This is kind of a forgotten war, but it's one in which the Red Army prevails. The future Marshal Zhukov, Stalin's leading general, is the one who fights the Japanese at this point and begins to develop his reputation. In the meantime, the Japanese, of course, are expanding, much to the alarm of the Americans. The Americans will now impose oil boycotts. They will embargo as well any kind of scrap metal, aluminum, iron, and so forth going to Japan that's so necessary for their military purposes, and things are getting tense to the point that eventually the Japanese are just going to try to knock out the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. So this is another thing that is driving the United States and Russia together, the East. We're forgetting, this part of the world. And Japanese expansion is extremely brutal in China. The Japanese have this racist attitude toward the Chinese. The Chinese are seen as kind of the inferior little cousins of the Japanese, and it's in fact it's a genocide in all aspects of that term. It's horrific what the Japanese will be doing in China, something that Japan has not acknowledged or apologized for to this day. It remains a very touchy issue, like the Nanking massacre and the rape of Nanking, as it's known. So this Japanese aggression, and in fact, technically speaking, the Second World War, if China, the Republic of China, is one of our allies in the Second World War, then really the Second World War begins in 1937. It doesn't begin on September 1st, 39. That's just for the Europeans. But for Chinese, their war with Japan began way back in 37. So they suffered perhaps more casualties than the Russians did in the Second World War, and they, as I say, regard the Second World War beginning in 1937, 2 years earlier than us in the West. It has been a bipolar world, certainly since the Cold War. It's hard to say whether Russia in the 1930s is as powerful as the United States. Really, the bipolarity of Russia and the United States really becomes evident when the Russians finally detonate a nuclear weapon in 1949. At that point, the two become superpowers, the only two nuclear powers until France and Britain join the nuclear family. But certainly in terms of ideologies, global ideologies, you do have this bipolar ideological world of American free enterprise capitalism and Soviet communist central planning economies. These two now are joined with a third ideological force, National Socialism, and it's kind of associated ideology, fascism. Nazis themselves, the National Socialists, would deny that they're fascists. They would refer to Franco and Mussolini as fascists, but they themselves are National Socialists, and I won't split hairs between the difference between National Socialism and fascism, but we generically refer to them all as fascists. Nonetheless, the coming of power on January 30th of Hitler and the Nazi Party is going to have tremendous effects on the Soviet Union's global strategy and, of course, how it will end up in its relations with the United States in this unfolding drama that's about to sweep Europe of the 30s and then become this catastrophic war of the 1940s. The United States, throughout this period, of course, is attempting, people describe it sometimes as isolationism, but it's not really isolationism. I think it's the best term for it would be non-entanglement. The United States is not isolationist. It is out there, certainly attempting all sorts of trade deals. It is in the middle of a depression, which makes that more difficult, but certainly it doesn't want to get entangled in any European wars. And so as Hitler begins dismantling the Versailles Treaty, certainly the United States is sitting this one out completely. They let the Europeans now settle this for themselves. We never really wanted to get involved in the First World War, and damn, if there's going to be a Second World War, that the United States is going to be involved in it. As much as Roosevelt hated the Nazis, was sympathetic to the Allies, and we'll see certainly Roosevelt through Lend-Lease was aiding the British cause in the early period of the war, but Congress, of course, would not let Roosevelt take the United States into the war. Hitler will very quickly, within a year, establish absolute control in Germany. His final key to control, of course, was the conquest of his own brown shirts, the radical revolutionary wing of the Nazi Party. Once he kills off the brown shirts in the Night of the Long Knives in the spring of 1934, he will have absolute power and control. He puts his opposition into concentration camps, in particular the Nazi Party. In fact, very quickly, as soon as you have the Reichstag fire, a month after Hitler takes power in February 1933, Hitler imposes these draconian emergency anti-terrorist laws, and the Communist Party are the first ones to be thrown into these improvised concentration camps. So later, Hitler will deal with the rest of the political parties until the Nazi Party will be the only one left. And by 1938-37, there is this kind of fascist triumvirate in Europe. Hitler, Franco, with Hitler's support, has taken power in Spain. Mussolini, of course, arrived on the scene before Hitler and Franco. In fact, Hitler was a great admirer of Mussolini. And of course, you have the regime of Salazar in Portugal, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Poland have these quasi-military governments, or certainly monarchies that are very responsive to the general staff, so they're almost military dictatorships. Fascism is the new flavor of the decade at that point, and as France, the democracies of France and Britain are succumbing to the impact of the depression, they become very unstable. And Hitler, of course, uses this to expand territorially in Europe. He already, contrary to the Versailles Treaty, has merged Austria with Germany, and he's allowed to do that because, of course, Austria is a German-speaking country, and even though it's prohibited under the Versailles Treaty, it's now too late. There's a lot of violations prior to that Hitler had committed, from expanding the size of his army to now building an air force, which was prohibited to him, and so forth. So, the taking of Austria, the Anschluss, which the Austrians happily actually entered into, they were quite overjoyed to become part of the greater German Reich, as it will now become known, as Germany begins claiming other territories. Next, of course, comes Czechoslovakia. Now, by this time, France and Russia have signed a military pact, a mutual assistance treaty, and then they co-signed with Czechoslovakia. Technically speaking, Russian deployment in defense of Czechoslovakia would be dependent upon France. If France gets involved in defending Czechoslovakia militarily, then Russia would do so as well. It's not an option that the Russians could choose themselves, but it becomes an issue as Germany begins threatening Czechoslovakia and demanding this part of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland, where there were German majorities. And Hitler is ready to invade Czechoslovakia, but of course, Chamberlain, the prime minister, gets wind of it and flies to Munich in September and October, the first example of a kind of shuttle diplomacy by aircraft, and manages to negotiate with Hitler, instead of a total invasion of Czechoslovakia, a transfer of Sudetenland territory to Germany, without really taking it up with the Czechs. It's just basically the terms are dictated to Czechoslovakia. The basis of the kind of dictation that the French and the British and the Italians as well was that, we made Czechoslovakia during the Versailles Treaty process. We can unmake Czechoslovakia if we want to. And that's exactly what they proceed to do. Chamberlain comes back from the Munich peace conference with Hitler, from this whole shuttle diplomacy process, with a piece of paper on which is written, I promise, or something like that. I promise this is my last territorial demand, and Hitler signs this. And Chamberlain, of course, famously, there's all this film footage of this at the airport as he arrives back in England. He's holding that piece of paper with Hitler's signature on it, fluttering in the wind, and famously says, "We have peace in our own time." And of course, that is entirely false. It's not going to happen. So Hitler now proceeds to gobble up this part of Czechoslovakia very quickly, under very unfavorable terms. There was a large Czech population there. The Slovaks are a majority further to the east, as you can see. but all the Czechs have to leave their homes, leave their property, the businesses, Czech army fortifications, munition plants that might be in the Sudetenland are supposed to be left. And it's literally done in a matter of weeks, the entire transfer. Or else Hitler threatened war. And in fact, Hitler is very disappointed that Chamberlain managed to make this a diplomatic resolution rather than a military one. This was supposed to have been, in September of 1938, Hitler's war, his first war. And of course, that is a disappointment that it did not occur. That, of course, doesn't change anything for Hitler. Hitler now, over the winter, proceeds to gobble up the rest of Czechoslovakia. He, first of all, in Sudetenland, again, just like in Austria, the Sudeten Germans welcome the German army entering the Sudetenland, which is now just incorporated directly into Germany, becomes part of Germany. Now, Hitler's agents foment rebellion and revolt in Slovakia. And the right-wing Nazi movement in Slovakia is backed by the Germans. As the Slovaks demand independence, Germany very quickly recognizes Slovakia, and at the same time, Germans declare as well that the rest of Czechoslovakia is persecuting Slovakian minorities there, and that Germany, being the good citizen, conscientious world citizen that they are, they're going to enter the rest of Czechoslovakia to protect the Slovak minority there. In this division, Poland is given a piece of Slovakia by the Germans. One of the reasons the Germans give that portion of Slovakia to Poland is as a reward, because at one point, Stalin offered to unilaterally deploy troops to Czechoslovakia in defense of any possible German threat if Poland agrees to the passage of Russian troops through Poland into Czechoslovakia. The Poles refused. And so the reward they get is a piece of Czechoslovakia, which they happily take. And the Hungarians get this part of Slovakia. Slovakia now will become a puppet state of Nazi Germany and will remain so until the end of the war, an ally of Germany. The rest of Czechoslovakia is now, as I say, occupied in March by the Nazis, and it becomes a Reichsprotectorate. This time, when the Nazis enter Prague, this time, for the first time, they're not welcome. They're not welcome the way they were in the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland, where everybody celebrated when Hitler took that piece of territory and deployed the German army there. Of course, it's Germany. They were not welcomed the way they were welcomed in the Saar, when the Saar voted to unify or reunify with Nazi Germany at that point. They weren't, the way they were welcomed in Slovakia or the way they were welcomed in Austria. Here in Prague, this is the first hostile occupation, and you certainly see it from the faces of the people watching the German army enter into the city of Prague, as this woman is giving the infamous ficus, a rude kind of salute with your thumb between your two fingers. So the issue now is getting very tense. Now the British realize after March that Hitler's signature and promise is worthless. Britain starts now a crash program of rearming. They know it's going to take them much longer than a year to be in any condition to confront Germany. France is in a state of political chaos, and so nobody wants to take an initiative against Germany, and certainly now it's too late. And this is, you can see how much territory Germany has taken at this point, as we're in um, in March 39. I'm not sure, I might have said in March 38 that Hitler entered Czechoslovakia was March 39th. In September, October 38 was the Munich Peace Conference, and then March 39, Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia. The French, as I say, have already aligned with Russia, and now the French and the British are considering whether they want to form the Grand Alliance the way it was in the First World War, Britain, France, and Russia against Germany. And there's a lot of suspicion, certainly on the British side, about this French-Soviet pact. In the British, especially Winston Churchill, although he's not prime minister, he's certainly a prominent member of parliament at this time, of course, have been anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist. Churchill in particular hates communism. Many Western democracies regard Hitler as still as the lesser evil between there's a choice between communism or Nazism or Stalin or Hitler, and so this French-Soviet pact is regarded with great suspicion. Love me, love my bear. The USSR is worried about Germany, and of course they are. First of all, right away, ideologically, Hitler, as I say, has essentially put the entire German Communist Party into concentration camps. Ideologically, he is on opposite poles from the Soviet ideology. In Mein Kampf, certainly Hitler has made it very evident and clear and explicit that Germany's future lies in Eastern expansion. Lebensraum is the term since the Teutonic Knights that the Germans have been using. Living space, Lebensraum, and particularly, of course, the grain fields of the Ukraine, the coal fields there, all these things Hitler has essentially said are going to be essential to the future growth of Germany. And so USSR knows essentially what Hitler has in mind. And so they begin to negotiate. Litvinov, Stalin's foreign minister, the one who negotiated now diplomatic recognition with the US. Litvinov believes in this kind of collective security agreement and thinks certainly it would be a good thing if Britain joined that alliance. And so certainly the Russians communicate to the British that they would be interested in expanding their kind of bilateral agreement that they have with France to include Britain now. Britain, suspicious of Stalin and the Russians, believes that the USSR actually is only trying to negotiate with Britain to put pressure on Germany for a better deal with Germany. And so while the British make kind of sounds that they are interested in discussing a alliance, the British, while taking up a discussion with the USSR, secretly now tell Germany that they have no intention of signing any agreement with Russia, that Germany and Britain have a future together. That's the British position at that time, and very much Hitler's as well. As Hitler is an Anglophile, was a great admirer of the British and the British Empire, and imagines an alliance between Britain and Germany against France, which, remember, is Britain's traditional enemy anyway. The British-French alliance in the First World War was kind of a perversion of over 1,000 years of history, where Germany and England have maintained these close relations. The Hanoverian dynasty, in fact, was German. So Prussia was always Britain's allies. Hanover was, and so forth. And so it is a natural alliance. And so Britain assures secretly Germany that they are not going to ever enter into any agreement with the Soviet Union and the communists. Don't worry about it. As they are negotiating with Russia, don't worry about it. They tell the Germans, we're just, going through the motions. Of course, the problem for Britain is that Stalin's secret service has completely penetrated the highest ranks of the British diplomatic service and intelligence service. The Kim Philby ring, the Cambridge Five, are reporting back to the Russians since Kim Philby since 1933. Burgess and McLean, I think in fact it's Donald McLean, who will be in the Foreign Office, who will inform the Russians of every secret communication between the British and the Germans as the British are kind of going through the motions of negotiating. After Czechoslovakia, the British now realize that really Germany might not be the partner that they wanted. And now they begin to press Russia at the same time as Germany starts pressing Russia to enter into a non-aggression pact. The Germans, British, want USSR now to commit to a tripartite pact between Britain, USSR, and France. And Stalin is certainly considering it. I mean, he realizes and understands how much Hitler and his regime may be as ruthless as he himself is, which is not a very good thing in terms of depending on each other. And one of the first things that Stalin asks, first of all, he contacts Poland, and again asks the Poles, if he enters this pact with Britain and France and Germany attacks them, will Poland allow Russian troops to go through Poland to attack Germany in the support of the British and French? And the Poles immediately say, not in 100,000 years. Forget about it. It will never happen. And there's a long, of course, antagonistic relationship between Poland and Russia, especially once Poland was remade in 1919. I mean, one of the only country that the Poles immediately go to war with is Russia at that point. So the hostilities and the threat is recent. And so the Poles have just been given a nice piece of Czechoslovakia by the Germans, which they happily took. So they're not going to betray their friendship and the pact that they had signed with Germany, which, by the way, was Hitler's first international pact, was with Poland, the non-aggression treaty. Stalin kind of shrugs his shoulders. That's not going to stop him. Well, if I have to fight my way through Poland, I'll fight my way through Poland if it's necessary. So the next thing that Stalin asks the British is, well, I'm ready to back Britain and France if Germany goes to war with either one of you. But if Germany goes to war with me, are you ready to back me up? And the British have nothing better to say than, well, let's cross that bridge when we come to it. And so now, um, as the summer approaches, Stalin tells the British that if you want to seriously negotiate some kind of treaty for me to join in, send quickly a delegation here. The British, rather than going by rail or flying on one of their Halifax bombers, which they already had by then, a um, team of diplomats, they send them by a slow boat to the USSR. And when they arrive finally after several weeks slow passage, they don't even have authority to negotiate, let alone sign any kind of agreement. And so immediately at this point, Stalin realizes that the British are playing a double game, as of course his intelligence had informed him. And so Litvinov, this is seen as a failure of Maxim Litvinov's collective security program is now discredited. The Germans, as they're now making all sorts of offers to Russia, make a point of indicating that Litvinov is Jewish. And Stalin now, for all those reasons, decides he's going to fire Litvinov and replace him with Molotov. Vyacheslav Molotov, that's again a revolutionary name, the way Stalin is a revolutionary name. Stalin means man of steel. Molotov means a man of the hammer. And so now Molotov is appointed Stalin's foreign minister, and he will be right into the 1950s until Stalin's death. And so Molotov and Ribbentrop in August, I think it was the 19th of August, about 2 weeks before they invade Poland, to the shock of everybody, they sign what will be the often described as the Ribbentrop-Molotov non-aggression treaty, the Soviet-German non-aggression treaty, but the Hitler-Stalin pact in all these different ways. Molotov, of course, is probably best known for the Molotov cocktail, even today. That's a term that emerges out of the war that the Russians will fight with the Finns. Finnish military and partisans invent the Molotov cocktail. Its purpose is it's mixed partly with a kind of any kind of oil or tarry system and gasoline, so it's a very sticky but liquid substance. The idea is how it's used. It's thrown against a tank, and then all this burning flame leaks in through the seams, all the metal seams of the tank, especially around the turret and the hatches. Today, because of the Molotov cocktail, tanks, of course, the seams are all sealed for any kind of liquid attack. This is kind of a predecessor, I guess, to napalm. Napalm works in the same way. But this was an effective weapon, certainly against Russian tanks in 1940 in the war in Finland. And what you're looking at is the proper way to make a Molotov cocktail. There's this kind of long match there with a flammable liquid taped securely to the bottle with a kind of metallic tape. And so you just yank the match, it sets that flammable white material afire, and then you throw the bottle, and when it breaks against the tank, the liquid spills out and drips into the tank and catches fire. So if you want to try this at home, kids, this is the way to do it. Don't do it like this, as for example, in these instructions that were actually the CIA would send this into South America, how to make a Molotov cocktail. This is guaranteed how to make a Molotov cocktail that will catch fire in your hand and make all that flammable liquid eject and cover you in flames rather than your target. But again, kids, don't try this at home. So it's a shock to everybody when Stalin makes this agreement with Hitler, because of course they're of opposing ideologies, as this very famous cartoon reminds everybody, as Hitler greets Stalin, the scum of the earth, I believe, the bloody assassin of the workers, I presume. And a lot of people questioned, how could Stalin, a communist, make a pact with this kind of opposing ideology? Well, now you know how and why. Hitler, by the way, offers to Stalin to take all the German communists he has in his concentration camp and put them on a train back to Russia. And Stalin's response was, "Nah, that's okay, you keep them." Because Stalin, of course, by this time is killing off his own communists, and leaving them in a Nazi concentration camp is a perfect mechanism for him to just to purge the German Communist Party of all its independent communists there, and in the future set up his own Stalin-sponsored Communist Party that he will control. So the fate of the communists, they remain in the concentration camps, although many of them survive. The communists, of course, the Communist Party has, already been operating clandestinely. They're well suited for it, and communist networks survive inside the inside the concentration camps, and so there's a high percentage of survivors from those German concentration camps that were members of the Communist Party and eventually rose up in the interior inmate concentration camp trustees. The communists ran often the administration office, they ran the photo office, and were, along with the criminals, were often, as I say, trustees in the Nazi system. And many of them survived from being imprisoned in 1933. They survived 12 years in the concentration camps right up until 1945. Not all, but many. Wonder how long the honeymoon will last. Indeed, everybody wonders about this. What, of course, they didn't know was there was a secret protocol that wasn't revealed until the 1990s. We all suspected it, of course, but it never was officially acknowledged by the Russians until Gorbachev officially acknowledged it shortly before he fell from power, that there was a secret annex in the non-aggression treaty that should, by any chance, either Germany or the USSR go to war with Poland, they will partition it together. And that, of course, is precisely what's going to happen. By now, Britain and France have given guarantees to Poland, again, in fear that the Poles might swing from German hostility to Russia, just to defend themselves against the Germans. And so rather than having Poland fall into a Russian sphere, or since potentially Germany, Poland, Russia might form an alliance, the French and British guarantee Poland's sovereignty against any invasion by the Germans or the Russians, for that matter, that they will protect the sovereignty of Poland. Those guarantees are also given to Romania on the Russian border there. So those begin to occur very quickly after Hitler revealed himself to be a liar after he finished off Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. It's the beginning of the war, at least again for the Europeans. September 1st, 1939, the invasion. The British declare and the French declare war September 3rd. Mackenzie King in Canada waits till September 10th just to show the British that Canadians are not the way they were in the First World War, that we're going to steer an independent path in this World War. And so we, as Canada, become involved in the war, as I say, September 10th. But for now, Britain and France immediately declare war, as they had promised, Poland, to support Poland, and then proceed to do nothing. The Blitzkrieg, often portrayed in our textbooks, certainly portrayed by German propaganda, is supposed to be this irresistible invasion of Poland. This, in fact, is not quite true. Germany suffers enormous losses of aircraft over Poland, unacceptable losses, mostly to ground fire. Although the Poles are supplied with British Hurricane fighters, they may have had some Spitfires at that point, but certainly Hurricanes they have. But again, most German aerial losses are to ground fire. In the first 10 days of the invasion of Poland, not a single major Polish city falls to German forces other than Krakow. And Krakow falls because it's a medieval city, it's a historical city. And so the Poles just left it as an open city. They declared they won't defend Krakow, and so German troops just walked into Krakow without fighting. Everywhere else, the Poles are fighting off the Germans relatively successfully. They're holding back the Germans, waiting for the British and French to now bolster them and deploy their troops against Germany. And of course, they're not, and they won't. And that is one of the reasons why the British, for example, buy into this whole Blitzkrieg myth, that the Blitzkrieg myth is irresistible. It's an excuse by Britain and France to explain why they couldn't help the Poles. Oh, it was the Blitzkrieg. You can't stop a Blitzkrieg when it's launched. And that's going to be the excuse again for the defeat of France as well, and why the British withdrew from the coast. Nobody is going to admit that they just weren't ready and unable to deploy, that all those assurances that they gave the Poles about defending Poland against German or Russian invasions, were bullshit, essentially. So this infamous blitzkrieg, as I say, often described as a quick defeat of the Poles, is not exactly that. One of the greatest um, myths of the blitzkrieg is how Polish cavalry attacked with lances, and again, against German tanks, and then were massacred. This was German Nazi propaganda, and as all propaganda, there's a grain of truth in it, indeed. Um, Polish cavalry did attack German tanks, and when they did, what actually happened is the German tanks were destroyed by the Poles. They didn't attack with lances. What the Poles did, the cavalry did. The days of cavalry charges have been over since Crimea in 1855. The Poles, of course, rode on the horse, but deployed as infantry with anti-tank weapons and destroyed those German tanks. And the other reason was, of course, those tanks were vulnerable. They had actually had run out of gas in that incident. And so this is why essentially those tanks ended up so vulnerable to Polish infantry. But this nonsense about Poles not knowing how to fight and attacking with lances was just German uh, propaganda, but it's one that everybody has bought into. Polish army was actually quite a formidable army. Back in 1920, they almost destroyed the Soviet Union. There were at the gates of Moscow against the Red Army until the British essentially saved the Russians for reasons of their own by negotiating a kind of a settlement between Poland. I think the British were more afraid of the Poles, who had an enormous army, very powerful. It was able to hold back the Germans long enough for the British and French to deploy had they been able to. Of course, what happens, what does bring down Poland is 17 days later, the Russians invade. And when the Russians come in, that's when it's over for Poland. At that point, within 3 weeks, Poland is unable to fight a two-front war without British and French support. And so eventually the Poles are overwhelmed by the Nazis and by the Bolshevik Russians. And that essentially cements the Blitzkrieg myth. The Blitzkrieg, everybody was aware of the Blitzkrieg. It wasn't something that the Germans had invaded. In fact, J.S. Fuller, a British officer, is the first one who drew up so-called breakthrough strategy plans during the First World War to break the stalemate. That essentially, the breakthrough plan is what the Blitzkrieg was about. And Blitzkrieg was not a word that the Germans themselves had used. It kind of emerged from British media. And so now, in partnership together, the Russian army, the Red Army, and the German army will partition Poland into two different territories. And this is kind of a renewal of the collaboration between Germany and Russia, between Weimar Germany. Remember that the Weimar German army was secretly training inside Russia out of view of the Versailles Treaty Commissioners in Russian chemical warfare schools, in Russian tank schools. That's where, quote, the Blitzkrieg was actually being perfected. And so 28th of September, the demarcation line is defined. It more or less is going to define the border of Poland and Russia to this day. This is going to be one of this line during the war is going to be one of the issues that is going to eventually lead to the Cold War between the United States and Russia when that time comes. But this line is very much close to what is the Curzon line, the line where as well Russia's border lay in the imperial era. It actually lay a little bit further west because Warsaw certainly was within imperial Russia prior to the First World War. The Polish government never surrenders. The Polish government moves, it evacuates from Warsaw and moves to London. They will become known as the London Poles. Unlike France, which formally surrenders, the Poles continue to carry on their government from London now. The Polish government in exile. Polish pilots, unlike French pilots, will fly their airplanes to Britain and will fight in the Battle of Britain. Polish pilots make a major contribution to the Battle of Britain. Polish submarines leave Poland and attach themselves to the British Navy as Polish battleships do. Thousands of Polish infantrymen manage to make their way through neutral countries into France. Those that were captured by the Russians will eventually, once Hitler and Russia go to war, will eventually end up deployed in Europe. The ones that the Russians didn't kill off at Katyn, the Russians will kill the entire officer class. But otherwise, Polish soldiers will continue to fight. So Poland just never surrenders. The government intact evacuates to London. Very much different than what the French do. There is no collaboration, Polish official collaboration, or a Polish puppet government. Poland is completely under German domination, and in fact, Poland ceases to exist as a nation. The fate that Poland is left to under Hitler is parts of Poland will just become parts of Germany, while one part of Poland is reserved, the general government, for where unwanted populations are going to be dumped, particularly Jews, Roma, Gypsies, and other peoples. And of course, eventually inside the general government is where the death camps will go up and where most of the Holocaust is going to unfold, and the gas chambers and that kind of mechanized genocide will be unfolding in this part of Poland called the general government. And Hitler sees it as a kind of a reservation in the sense that we use that term with indigenous natives, a kind of reservation for the Jews until the decision in 1941 will be made to actually, rather than keep them on a, quote, ghetto-like reservation, that they will exterminate them. So somewhere, I think October 13th, formally Poland ceases to exist, and it's divided. As I say, it becomes Russian territory on its side and German territory on the German side. November, the Russians go to war now with Finland over territory that they want to recover for themselves. That was also imperial territory. June of 1940, Stalin invades Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, consolidating now his kind of territorial frontier with Germany. And now Germany is beginning to border with Russia. And at this point as well, um, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria join the Axis, the German-Italian bloc. And so you're beginning to see this kind of formation that the Russians are facing. The French and British, it's what's known at this point a phony war, or as some call it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. There are engagements in the air. There are some minor naval engagements, but there is no land battles. The French and British are just sitting there doing absolute nothing as Germany continues now consolidating its victories in Poland and rebuilding its army, and all those huge losses they had of aircraft over Poland. They're rebuilding those aircraft for the next phase. Italy, in the meantime, has moved into Albania as Mussolini begins to expand his his empire. April 1940, Hitler now preempts a planned invasion by the British of Norway. And to boot, he takes Denmark at the same time. And shortly after this, Churchill now becomes prime minister, and almost at the same time, the Western Blitzkrieg against the French and British now occurs, with the Netherlands and Belgium and Luxembourg now invaded as well. In the First World War, the Germans bypassed the Netherlands, not this time. There was a big mistake, they realized, not having invaded the Netherlands because of course, the coast of the Netherlands. And so now Germany takes everything. The French army, again, there is this kind of myth that the French army all immediately surrendered, that the French army, had superior tanks to the German ones, but they just didn't know how to use them. Well, ask Rommel about the Battle of Gembloux, when French tanks destroyed half the tanks of his division there. The French knew how to fight with tanks, believe me. However, what was lacking was resolve in Paris. And the French government very quickly collapsed and surrendered. It was a political defeat as opposed to a battlefield defeat. The Germans had in fact estimated that would take them a year of fighting to bring down the French, instead of almost, it was slightly over 30 days in which France collapsed completely and fell. Unlike the Poles, the French government did not move into exile to London. The French Navy refused to scuttle its ships or sail its ships away from German naval officers taking command over them. And in fact, the British had to bomb the French fleet in the Mediterranean, killing thousands of French sailors because the French refused, as I say, to resist this agreement that a new French government had made with the Germans. And of course, as a reward, Vichy France is allowed to keep a major part of France, and France as well is allowed to keep its colonies. And that, of course, seals the fate of the Jews, because the German plan, although it wasn't fully committed to yet, was to deport the Jews of Europe to the island of Madagascar, which was a French colony. And once the French are allowed to keep their colony, of course, the French would not approve that. And so the French keep Vietnam as well until the Japanese demand Vietnam, and Vichy France just hands it over as a fellow ally of both the Japanese and the Germans. Vichy France is seen essentially as an enemy. They're allowed to keep, as I say, their colonies in North Africa as well. When the Allies invade North Africa, in Operation Torch in 1942, before they can get at Rommel's Africa Corps, they have to fight their way through the French. De Gaulle is the only, well, not the only one, but the leading French officer who refuses to comply with orders from the new government to surrender. And immediately de Gaulle is declared a traitor, and a price is put on his head by the French. And de Gaulle goes to London, where he forms the Free French. But the Free French, unlike the Polish government in exile, have no recognition, not yet, as a representative of France. As far as the Allies are concerned, half of France is under German military occupation, while the other half, Vichy France, are the enemy and an ally of Germany. The Free French at this point are a resistance group that Churchill is sponsoring, but they're not seen as the legitimate representatives of France at that moment in time. Hitler, of course, makes this half-day tour of Paris. Marshal Pétain is appointed as the president of France, and the leader of its kind of right-wing Nazi party, Pierre Laval, becomes the premier. And the two will now work with Nazi Germany in seeking Nazi gains and aims. And the German army now settles for this very comfortable, luxurious occupation of Paris. Again, the United States is watching all this with great concern, especially FDR. FDR does want to intervene in the war, but Congress won't let him. So the best FDR can do, as England becomes the only democracy standing, is Lend-Lease, sending supplies essentially to the British. The Battle of Britain is fought now between July and September of 1940. The purpose of this battle is to soften Britain for Operation Sea Lion, which would have been the invasion of Britain. German troops are ready and mobilized to cross the Channel, invade Britain. The Gestapo already has these famous published lists of who in Britain would have been arrested and immediately shot. But for various reasons, I think beyond the scope of these lectures, the Battle of Britain fails. And now, somewhere late 1940, Hitler now issues instructions to the German General Staff to start drawing up plans to invade the Soviet Union, what will become known as Operation Barbarossa. Hitler has read his history books. He knows what happened to Napoleon. He knows that it's very easy getting into Russia. It's much harder getting out of Russia. He knows the impact that winter had on Napoleon's army. It is Hitler's intention to invade Russia in May, in order that he can be in Moscow by the end of the summer and be completely in control of Soviet European territory by the time the first snows of winter are supposed to come. That was the plan until Mussolini invades Greece around the spring of sort of invade, yeah, spring of 1940. I have here October 1940, I think. If I'm not mistaken, it came a little later, might have been October. Invades Greece and, of course, gets bogged down in Greece. The Greeks resist tenaciously the Italian army, and so now Mussolini begs help from Germany to consolidate his hold over Greece, and certainly Hitler wants Greece under control because Greece is key for the British. It's a key base in the Mediterranean. It's key for the British in terms of the approach to the Suez Canal in Egypt. And so Hitler agrees. He asks the king of Yugoslavia if he will allow German troops to pass through Yugoslavia. The king agrees, but Serbs the in the Serbian army absolutely see Germany, Austria as former occupiers of Yugoslavia and overthrow the king and seize control and immediately say no to Hitler. You're not passing through Yugoslavia to attack our Greek neighbors. And of course, you can't say no to Hitler. April 6th, Hitler invades Yugoslavia and takes control there. He'll set up this puppet regime of Croatia in the north. Again, a whole other history, but certainly a lot of the blood that was spilled in the 1990s in Yugoslavia between Croats and Bosnians as well, and Serbs has to do with Hitler's ethnic policies and divisions during the Second World War in that part of the world. And then Hitler has to fight his way through Greece, and including fighting British troops in Crete, who are trying to hold off German invasion there. So really, he's got to take off all the troops and armor that he had online at the Russian border. He's got to take them offline, bring them down to, first of all, through Yugoslavia, then into Greece. And so it won't be until June 22nd, 1941, that Hitler will be ready now to invade Russia. And that, of course, Operation Barbarossa will occur June 22nd, 1941. And that's the end of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Russian-German non-aggression treaty. Bulgarian troops, Hungarian troops, Finnish troops, as well as Romanian troops and Italians as well who deploy in Russia. It's 3 million men invade Russia. It's the largest invasion in the history of the world. 3 army groups. And as Hitler said, all I have to do is kick in the door and the entire rotting edifice will come down around me. Indeed, that's precisely what it looks like is happening in Russia as the Red Army essentially collapses in this onslaught. Russian armies are surrendering by the 100,000. And the Germans are driving them like cattle. The rights and privileges under the Geneva Convention are not recognized by the Germans in the East. Russian POWs are not treated in the same way as French or British or American POWs will be at the hands of the Germans. Essentially, over 1 million Russian POWs will be starved to death by the end of that first summer. They're just left out in these open fields with no shelter, no food, nothing, until they end up just cannibalizing each other or dying from deprivation, hunger, and disease. The Russian particularly in the south, Ukrainian population welcomes the entry of the Germans as liberators from Stalin's oppression, especially after collectivization and the famines of the 1930s. Nothing would appear to the Ukrainians as anything worse than Stalin. And there are hopes that Germany will sponsor a Ukrainian nation. Women bring traditional offerings of bread and salt to the Germans. They make sandwiches for them. But of course, Germany is a racial state. There are absolute no plans whatsoever to establish even a puppet Ukrainian state under the Germans, although some elements in the German government give lip service to that. Alfred Rosenberg, for example. However, Alfred Rosenberg, despite the fact that he's appointed by Hitler as the governor of Russian occupied territory, actually has very little power when compared to what Himmler wants to do in Russia, and that's enslave everybody and kill whoever is left over. And so this brutal occupation begins of all of Russia, including the Ukrainian region. Villages are deported into slave labor into Germany, and Germans will hang, burn, kill, rape, and destroy the population in this massive genocide that goes beyond just the Einsatzgruppen shootings of Russian Jews, but it extends to all military age Russians who are not working in any kind of German enterprise are essentially rounded up in the fields as the Germans encounter them and shot by the edge of the wheat field. And so as news of what happens to POWs in the German camps begins to get back to the people, POWs stop surrendering and now begin to fight to the death rather than surrender. And of course, a partisan movement now rises up against the Germans as well. And the partisan movement is not so much about, Russian patriotism. It's about just survival. This is a racial genocidal war that the Nazis are waging in Russia. The Germans push, as I say, very quickly through territory, Russian territory. I won't get again into the details of why Hitler arrived so late at the gates of Moscow, but on the night of December 5th, 6th, Hitler gets as far as the suburbs of Moscow. In fact, if you ever travel in Moscow, from downtown Moscow on the way to the airport, there is this German tank, sitting by the side of the road on the road to the airport, to Sheremetyevo Airport, with its treads blown up. That tank is left there as a monument to how far the Germans got into Moscow. And if Moscow was Toronto, that tank would have been around where Airport Road and Kipling is, a 30-minute drive in good traffic into downtown Moscow. That's how close the Germans got. But on the night of the 5th and 6th, they just could not push any further. And that's when the Russians as well launched their first counterattack. They don't destroy the Germans at Moscow, but they stop them there. It's the first really defeat of Hitler. It's not a, like I say, a loss the way it will be at Stalingrad the next year, but it's a defeat. He doesn't get Moscow. Leningrad, of course, goes into that 900-day siege, one of the longest and most brutal sieges in modern war history. The Americans, in the meantime, Harriman, of course, is the envoy. They're very hostile throughout the 1930s and constantly chide the Russians for various violations of the recognition agreement. For example, the Russians were not supposed to wage communist propaganda in the West. The Comintern was supposed to be leashed. Stalin does none of this. The Americans noted, but they don't challenge those things. But the Americans are insisting that Stalin must democratize. And so as Moscow is under siege, the Americans are, through that summer, through right up to, like I say, December 5th, are making all these stipulations that if they want help from the Americans, they have to democratize, in particular, on the issue of religious freedom. And indeed, Stalin will kind of loosen his grip on religious freedom, but I think it's partly because of the American pressure, but partly as well to kind of now galvanize his people to the reality of a kind of loyalty that goes beyond that of the Communist Party, a loyalty to old Russian values, religion, the Russian land, the motherland, and so forth. He begins to change the uniforms of the Russian army to look more like the traditional old-time Imperial Russian uniforms. He knows, as he told his son, even I'm not Stalin, all right? He knows exactly how people have not yet quite bought into communism, and so he is beginning to, under these war issues, not necessarily reform, but loosen his grip on some aspects of Russian society. But the Americans are definitely dragging their feet, and Americans are not quite, well, certainly Roosevelt is absolutely sure that the Nazis are the worst evil. A lot of members of Congress, particularly in the Republican Party, particularly Southern congressmen, are a little warmer to Hitler and absolutely hostile to the idea of an alliance with the Soviet Union. And as Truman himself, who's going to be the Roosevelt's vice president in his last term, and then will become president near the end of the war, Truman essentially says, well, if the Russians are winning, we should help the Germans. If the Germans are winning, we should help the Russians. That would be the best policy for the United States. So Americans are kind of biding their time. Here you can see from the Library of Congress, this photograph that had the caption, "Avoiding eye contact, Harriman and Stalin." All this, of course, comes to an end on December 7th, a few days after the Battle of Moscow begins, when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. The Americans now go to war, of course, with Japan. Hitler foolishly, stupidly declares war on the United States, and now Roosevelt gets his wish. He has a declaration of war. The Nazis have done Roosevelt a favor. He doesn't even have to discuss whether to declare war against Germany, since Germany declared war against the United States. It's a done deal, and the United States now enters the Second World War, and suddenly Russia, Britain, and the United States, along with the Republic of China, are allies. Quickly, the war goes on. Summer of 42, the Germans launch a second Operation Barbarossa in the south, this time towards the oil fields, towards the Caspian Sea, towards those oil fields there. Um, the Americans in November of 1942 and the British Operation Torch land in Morocco and Algeria and fight their way through the French to get at Rommel, who has been there since the Italians got bogged down in North Africa as well. Rommel was deployed there. The threat, of course, is through the Suez Canal, which the Germans never managed to capture. January of 43, of course, Rommel by now is bottled into Tunisia, and he will have to escape to Italy. Stalingrad begins the final phase of that battle. There will be a huge, of course, catastrophic defeat of Hitler at Stalingrad. It's considered the turning point of the war, the Battle of Stalingrad, because Hitler here is not only stopped, he loses the entire German Sixth Army and the Fourth Panzer Army. Field Marshal von Paulus is captured. The first time ever a German field marshal is captured on the field and surrenders. In fact, Paulus was a General Oberst. We don't have that kind of rank in the American-British system. Colonel General, General Oberst, but it's the most senior general's rank. Hitler promotes Paulus in the last days of the battle to field marshal, reminding Paulus that a field marshal has never been captured alive on the field. Hint, hint, make sure you blow your brains out before the lines collapse. Paulus declines to shoot himself, and he will become a voice on Russian propaganda radio against Germany, and eventually will be a senior general in the East German army. By May, the Russians are pushing back. The Germans, you get the last kind of German offensive at Kursk, Operation Citadel, July 1943, where the Germans are defeated. It's the last time they kind of have a momentum on the Eastern Front. By now, July 10th, the Allies invade Sicily and begin to fight their way through Germany. The Soviets are pushing and pushing, getting now closer and closer to the borders of Poland, Romania, and so forth. And the Allies are now pushing land in Italy, right there, and are pushing up the Italian peninsula. The Italians surrender to the Allies, and as a result, in September of 43, Hitler now invades Italy and puts Italy under German military occupation. Mussolini, who's a prisoner of the Italian Republic, is rescued by German paratroopers, by Otto Skorzeny, and he will be set up in Salò, in northern Italy. There'll be a puppet Italian fascist government, while a parallel Italian government, kind of exile government, is kind of a lame duck government, essentially, as Italy just goes under military occupation by both sides, as the Allies and the British, including a number of Canadian forces, are fighting in Italy. And so it's going to be in November of 1943 now, at Tehran in Iran, that the three top dogs of Britain, US, and the Soviet Union come together face to face. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. This is the first time a sitting American president meets with a Russian ruler, with certainly at this point we could call Stalin a dictator. It's the first time there is this kind of meeting, and Roosevelt and Stalin fall in love with each other. They just get along great. They have both the same sense of humor. They both have the same plans for France. Roosevelt and Stalin plan to treat France in the same way as they plan to treat Germany. France is going to be treated as an enemy. Her colonies are going to be stripped. Her France's army, air force, navy are going to be scrapped, just the way Roosevelt had been talking about doing it. So they are, as I say, they see a kind of decolonization. The Second World War is an opportunity to decolonize, for an opportunity for decolonization. And in fact, Stalin and Roosevelt often joke that just don't tell, we'll do it, but just don't tell Winston about it. Don't tell Winnie, because of course Winston Churchill would be absolutely opposed to decolonization of French territories because of India and the British, all the British colonies. But that's the plan these two have. They often meet with aside from Churchill. Stalin and Roosevelt make all sorts of economic post-war plans, how they're going to divide up Europe and the rest of the world, what is going to be done in China. Stalin, for example, reassures Roosevelt that he will continue supporting Chiang Kai-shek, is not going to even give a single rifle to Mao Zedong. A whole host of agreements for the future of the world are agreed upon. Many of those terms, as I say, behind Winston Churchill's back, are agreed upon how the world will be divided between the US and Russia. And at the center is this economic plan for the sale of American consumer goods into Russia. Russia is going to be opened up to American products in exchange for natural resources that the United States is going to get cheap from Russia. So they're looking forward to, once the war is over, dividing up the world between themselves, and very good economic relations. As this cartoon suggests here, this is a poignant moment, of course, for Roosevelt. I'm glad you dug up your Constitution, Joe. I can't find ours. This, of course, is a reference to Roosevelt's fight with the United States Supreme Court. A nice moment to review that as what is unfolding south of our border currently in these last days of the election, and Trump's intention to, along with the Republicans in the Senate, to appoint one more Supreme Court justice before the election. The Supreme Court, of course, had ruled that Roosevelt's New Deal and labor legislation and relief in the era of the Depression were unconstitutional. The NRA, the National Recovery Agency or National Recovery Administration, the court ruled was unconstitutional. And so what Roosevelt threatened to do was to expand the justices from maybe 9 to 17, and then appoint all the new justices during his term who would have played ball more. And that was a very real threat that the conservative Supreme Court justices had to weigh. It was a very political conflict, and Roosevelt essentially won. The Supreme Court began backing down from what Roosevelt had intended to do, and so, if certainly if Joe Biden wins the election, and there are problems with the Supreme Court, if um, in Biden's future, if he wins, then it is still an option for a sitting American president, and if he has a very good majority in Congress, to expand the numbers on the Supreme Court and appoint the kind of justices they want there. Of course, that means that any Republican return can certainly expand the Supreme Court even more. So I think, how the British and Russians are now going to wage war, and how this is going to now, at the end of the war, this kind of very friendly relationship, how it's going to suddenly go bad, and how the Cold War will arise out of this kind of understanding that everybody seems to have, including Winston Churchill, as suspicious as he is of the Russians. I think Winston Churchill is beginning to realize that the Nazis are actually much more worse, or the Nazis, as he used to call them. But I think I've painted myself into a corner here. I've reached kind of the halfway point in the course that I had hoped to deliver to you all. I think I've come to kind of the season finale here. I think the conduct of the war, the Cold War, Gorbachev's perestroika, the Yeltsin years, and the coming of Putin, I feel would take another 10 lectures to do, or 8 lectures at least, to do as extensively as I've been able to do this. I think I underestimated just the complexity of the earlier relationship between the Soviet Union, or Russia, and the United States. And so I'm going to offer to Life a part 2, season 2 of these courses. Lobby them to do this if enough of you are interested in completing this right up to the Putin era. I certainly would like to do this course, and I'd like to do it in the kind of depth I've been doing it. So write your sponsor, write your network. I'm going to pitch them at it. Maybe, although it doesn't look like it, maybe by the winter we'll be seeing each other, but it is unlikely. I do miss doing these courses with you live, being there, and just having this kind of fluid discussion that we often had. It was great being there, because I learned so much from all of you as well. And I say I miss doing these courses in person. I wish I was there with you, rather than sitting in these kind of dark, gloomy days alone here, talking at a empty screen. There's nobody there. So all the best to you, and watch your calendar. As I say, do write. Do write Life if you would like to see a part 2, a completion of this course. My apologies in making this larger than I thought. I think I really did bite off more than I could chew through in 8 lectures. I do want to give you a deeper understanding of it, rather than giving you something shallow that you can read on Wikipedia. Who needs me for that? So I'm glad I was able to at least take you through to the outbreak of the Second World War. I think this is a good point to complete this first part of the course. Since, like, as I say, my fault, I painted myself into this corner. This is a good moment to break, and hopefully I will be completing this course with you come winter. Thanks so much, and all the best to you, and stay healthy. Wear that mask and wash your hands.